I would like cities to be safe, inclusive, of everyone in them, and productive, where everybody can reap the benefit of living in a city. I am Siphelele Ngobese. I work for the South African Cities Network as a researcher looking at inclusive cities, with a focus on urban safety, integrated human settlements, and public transport, really just about making cities more equitable, more inclusive, particularly of more vulnerable people in our cities. A city is about people. It's about all the opportunities we can all harness to better our lives and to access better livelihoods. It's where life is lived, and it's where we all go to realize our best potential. That's what cities are to me. I think from an inclusivity perspective, firstly, it's about, do cities or can cities include everyone? Can they be places where everyone can meet their best potential? Can they be places where everyone is safe? And safety for me is one of those critical components that is also a developmental question. And so if a city is not safe, it cannot meet its objectives in terms of, the responsibility of cities. I think beyond just the mechanical delivery of services, of basic services, cities are also about, and they are also the drivers of sustainable development. So one of the key issues is the role of cities in driving inclusive growth and sustainable development, and can they take everyone along? So that's one major issue. Secondly, I would think in terms of just the inclusion of more vulnerable groups. Are cities for women? Do cities work for women? Do they work for children? Do they work for people with disabilities? Just as an example of some of the vulnerabilities that play out in the urban setting. And in my view, if cities work for the most vulnerable in our societies, then they can be cities that work for everyone. So that's the second thing about getting cities to a position where they work for the most vulnerable. And I think that's something that applies to cities globally. Some are performing better at this. I find the city of Barcelona to be actually doing great, just like by engaging with public space in the city. I'm seeing that it's a city that has been very intentional about the inclusion of people from all walks of life, walkability, efficient public transport, and all of that stuff. And these investments and these public goods are not just infrastructure for the sake of infrastructure, but they are really things that are there to help people unlock better livelihoods and more sustainable livelihoods. The third thing, which I think is a challenge of many cities at the global level, I think a lot of cities are faced with how to efficiently and to better manage and handle migration. And so I think it's a global phenomenon. People are always moving around. People are always trying to find better opportunities, make better lives for themselves. But with the way that migration is happening, seemingly at a much more rapid rate than before, it's not likely to stop, something that's only likely to continue. But I think cities must find ways to better manage migration for the betterment of all of humanity and for the better livelihoods of all people. Those are the three major things that I think are of great importance. Of course, there's more, but for me, top of mind, those are some of the things. In the South African context, our president recently mentioned gender-based violence as the second pandemic in our country. That was in the context of COVID-19, where it kind of exposed and revealed the real challenge of gender-based violence, where I think around the globe, many governments declared states of lockdown, right? And in our context, and I'm sure in many other contexts, you know, women or victims of abuse, let me say, from whatever gender they are, found themselves kind of confined in place with their abusers. And it's not something that only began during COVID-19, of course, but it just highlighted and kind of made it much more apparent, the gravity of the challenge and the gravity of the situation. I would say that's one of the key challenges in a South African context. And I think cities are critical to that as the spheres or the level of the state that's closest to the people, closest to communities, closest to households. They have a critical role to play in kind of shifting the situation and changing the tide of gender-based violence. And in what particular ways do cities have a role to play? In our context, in our finding, our data suggests that, public space is one of the key areas or key sites where violence is most likely to take place, particularly violence against women and children. And so cities, municipalities, as custodians of space, have a critical role to play there. How do they make public spaces such as pavements, parkings, parks, and open public spaces more safer? What interventions do they put in place? And as we understand again from our research, is that space is a key site that can either enable and encourage violence and crime or disable violence and crime. And so because cities are custodians of space, I think they are a key player and a key actor in intervening in one of the key sites where violence happens. So from an urban safety reference group perspective, one of the key examples for me of cities actually intervening in those particular areas is around the co-design of parks with children, which the city of Johannesburg has tested and done in a park called N Street North Park in the city's inner core, where they used Minecraft to engage children as co-designers of the park space, speaking to their needs and speaking to what they think would make the space more welcoming and more efficient and functional. The other example of very positive and good practice coming out of South African cities is, again, what the city of Johannesburg is doing in partnership with UN Habitat and various other partners called the Her City initiative, where, again, I think in a public space setting, going back to what I was saying about public spaces being the key sites of violence and the key areas of intervention for cities. And so the city is doing quite a lot of instrumental work to make city spaces safer for women. And so they've come up with a toolkit and a how-to guide on how they can make cities safer for women. There's a range of other initiatives that cities are involved with that are really impressive for me. The city of eThekwini, otherwise what we would otherwise know as Durban, has a really interesting intervention and an initiative around homelessness, and it's very holistic. It's not just about policing, but it's also about skills training, potential job placing, training homeless persons that are living in parks as co-managers of parks, and also training them in terms of skills development around recycling and environmental sustainability as well. And it was particularly important during the COVID-19, where lockdowns were enforced by governments and cities found themselves having to confront or being confronted with the issue of homelessness. But then how do they come together as a city to engage with this issue. So you've got a public safety department that saw it as important to work with other departments, realizing that the issue of homelessness is a social development issue, is an economic development issue. It's also a health issue in terms of substance abuse. And so bringing all these functions together, coming together, and I think one of the challenges which it cuts across the globe is that of working in silos. And I think that's one example of how cities, responded so well and partnered and worked together in really unique and never before seen ways, and coming together to work on an issue. And there've been such positive outcomes out of that as well. So those are just some of the examples of what cities are doing in South Africa. For me, my aspirations for cities is that they are more inclusive of women, of children. I have a particular passion for the inclusion of children in our cities. How do we plan our city spaces, not only so that they accommodate children, but they involve children in their planning and design? So I spoke to, public space as a key site that we need to intervene in order to make the situation better. And I think it's one of the key sites for the inclusion of children, just in the co-design of parks, in the co-design of pavements. And if we really were to plan our cities for the smallest of our citizens, I think they would function better for all people. And so how do you make a city space, a pavement, a park space, public transport more accessible to, more attractive to, and more inclusive of a smaller person, a child? And I think that's one thing that I would want to see us as planners, particularly, being more conscious of and being more intentional about including children. And so there's many different ways in which we can do that. And there's many great examples of cities already doing that kind of work. What other thing I might mention that I would like to see by 2030? It's really around, the goals that we all share that are common amongst all of us. So we speak of the Sustainable Development Goals, we speak of the new urban agenda, and what these pieces of global policy aspire to in terms of inclusive, productive, safe and livable cities, and also just economies of cities that are so inclusive as well. So I would like to see cities that are much more inclusive in terms of their economies, much more enabling in terms of how much they enable different people from all walks of life to reap the benefit of living in cities, to reap the urban dividend. So those are the two things that are top of mind for me in that sense.